Welcome to the first episode of the Functioning Griefster, dedicated to my journey with my son, Dec, who I sadly lost nearly 2 years ago. So who is Dec? Wow. So Dec had the most beautiful freckles. When he was little and didn't like them, I told him they were kisses from angels. He was the cutest little boy, and he grew into the most incredible young man. Having Duchenne's, a terminal muscle wasting condition, didn't define Dec whatsoever. It was very low down on who he is. Dec is funny, very funny. He could just, it was his one-liners. His one-liners what would get you. And his knowledge of useless information. Sometimes he would come in and just say to me, "Mom, did you know?" And I would roll my eyes and he'd be like, "I know you're not interested, but can I tell you?" And it would be something about the moon or an engine or something that I probably didn't have much interest in, but seeing his face light up because he wanted to tell me was enough for my ears to turn on and listen. So yeah, he was the fact master, full of useless information. He had a really lovely smile, and I think the biggie was the twinkle in his eyes. Dec was a man of few words, but when he said something, you listened. And sometimes he would just have this twinkle in his eyes that he used to call it that we were like E.T. and Elliot. We had like this special bond where we kind of knew how each other were feeling and thinking, and just by looking sometimes. I said it was more like a twin bond, but he always used E.T. and Elliot. He did actually really like that film. Dec, despite everything he was going through, losing the ability to walk, having a 9-hour spinal operation, losing the ability to feed himself, like raising his hands up, to in the latter stages, not being able to breathe without a ventilator. Dec never thought, why me? And he was still there for his friends. If anyone needed Dec, Dec was there, even if it meant talking to them till 2 o'clock in the morning because they were having trouble with their boyfriend or girlfriend or family issues. Dec was there to listen. And he was such a good listener. He had his Air Force Ones, were his trainer of choice, had them in so many colours. And his glasses, his Air Force Ones, and this van, they represent Dec. And his glasses now sit proudly at the front of the van, so he can always see where we're going. His chair has never left the van. And I wear his St. Christopher and his ring, which actually has the ashes of his first dog, Dottie, in. Dec could tell you anything about an engine. And he was so intuitive with his own body. He knew something wasn't right, but the hospital wouldn't listen. And this is one thing we found throughout his life, that people, the medical profession, CHC, people in general, seem to look at someone that is an electric wheelchair user and don't seem to think they've got much to offer and don't listen to their voice, when in actual fact they know their bodies so well. And Dec was very in tune to his body. He always knew if he had a chest infection, exactly where it was, even though the respiratory team said he couldn't possibly know it. He did. He was so in tune with his own body. And he tried to tell them he wasn't feeling right. And 2 doctors ignored him and said that he was absolutely fine. Unfortunately, I was in hospital myself at the time having surgery, and that's something that I have to live with, because if I had been there, I would have shouted louder, because that's what I'd done for years. Dex spoke. If he wasn't listened to, I spoke a few notches louder. And once I was home after surgery, I could tell something was not right with Declan. But he'd been having carers. We had had so many issues with care companies. Again, care companies sending in people that had no real care experience with someone that had all the needs that Dec did. You know, you cannot send someone that has one client who is a little old lady that needs her breakfast and expect that same person with only half a day training to be competent enough to look after someone who needs hoisting, respiratory physio, medication that's literally keeping them alive, ventilation. So carers didn't stay. Care companies didn't stay because they were being asked to do things that they just simply weren't able to do. But that is how this country's care system seems to work. So Dec wasn't being listened to when I wasn't there. But when I got home, I knew something wasn't right. An ambulance was called after Dec's heart went into VF, which means his heart rate went really, really high. The ambulance crew weren't going to take him in because his heart rate had gone back down. But I kept saying, I know my son, listen to him, something is not right. When we got to the hospital, they even said that they thought some of the blood tests were wrong because he should be a lot sicker. They repeated the blood tests and they were right. Declan had pneumonia, acute kidney injury and sepsis that had gone untreated because people weren't listening. What this meant, besides him feeling pretty ill, was that he wasn't going to be able to have his heart medication because it's filtered through the kidney and it would make the kidney worse. So he stopped it for a week or 10 days whilst being monitored in the hospital and then went back on it. The problem is the damage had been done. And after a few weeks, they said that he could no longer take his heart medication because his kidneys just couldn't tolerate it, and that he would need to be seen by the urology department to kind of figure out what to do next. That appointment never came. During this time, we were told Dec would now receive the level of care that he deserved and needed, including palliative care, because this was May the 16th and we were told he'd be unlikely to make the new year. The care didn't come. The palliative care team literally came to do the assessment the day before he died. But what that news did do, so the bucket list was formed, and unfortunately it wasn't fulfilled, but Dec got to be rich for a day, or that's what he called it. Basically, he had a personal shopper at Selfridges, and he picked a couple of items that he said he felt amazing in, and of course he bought a new pair of Air Force Ones. We went to watch Mrs. Doubtfire in the theatre and afterwards met the cast, and Dec even interviewed the person that played Mrs. Doubtfire. We went out to a really beautiful restaurant where We bumped into John Cena, and we went to watch Harry Styles at Wembley, which was incredible. But I could see Dec getting weaker, and people still weren't listening. It's almost they'd given the news and were just waiting for him to die. But we weren't. We were still living. And then on the 26th of August 2023, we'd been waiting in all morning for the palliative care team to come, and they didn't come. And Dec was just fed up of just waiting in, so he asked to go for a drive, which was something we would just do sometimes, put the music on, go for a drive, and just chat. There's something about being in a car, not being face to face, and just being able to chat. And that's what we did. But the crazy thing is, the chat ended up being very deep, and I remember even saying to him that I felt he was my soulmate, that people think soulmates are the person you share your bed with, but it can be a friend, it can be a relative, and yeah, it can be your partner. And for me, as I told Dec that day, there was no one that has ever come into my life that I felt that way about, that I could spend endless time, that I could be in lockdown with and never get bored of. The person that I wanted to share everything with, the person that really saw me, really heard me. That's your soulmate. And Dec and I have such a deep connection. There's no way that that's not what it is. And then we went to KFC, sat outside KFC, tried to eat, but neither of us were feeling it. And then he said the little bit he did have had upset his tummy. He was like, can we get home? So I was driving home, still listening to the Beach Boys, and I asked Dec if there was anything more I could do as his mom. Anything. And we were at a roundabout, just a few miles from our house. And he said, no, Mum, you're amazing. The lights turned to green and I pulled off. By the time I looked up at him, at the other side of that roundabout, he'd gone. And I knew he'd gone. I don't know what came over me then, because I pulled over, I checked for a heartbeat, I rang 999, and they wanted me to start doing chest compressions. I am actually medically trained with England Rugby, but Dec had signed a DNR only weeks beforehand, after the cardiology department told him that when his heart stopped, that if he was brought back, he probably wouldn't be him, and he definitely wouldn't have the mental capacity because of starvation of oxygen to the brain. So I respected that. Every inch of me wanted to pound his chest and keep him alive and keep him with me. But that's not what he wanted. He had said if he couldn't be exactly how he was, if his quality of life was less, then he was ready to go. So with dignity, I let him go. I stroked his face and told him I'd look after him, that I'd look after his body. And I then sat and waited with him the ambulance came, and straight away they cut through his t-shirt, one of his favourite ones that he had got from a gig that we went to the weekend, and they cut through it and put on the defib. And I was like, please don't shock him. And I said he had a DNR, a do not resuscitate, but until I could present it, they shocked him. I saw his arm fly off the armrest of his wheelchair. And I just begged him to stop, and I found the DNR and gave it to him. And then Dec's body could be at peace. We then had to wait for another team to come to take Dec in an ambulance to the mortuary. And for the first time ever, I wasn't allowed in the ambulance with him. But I held his head as they held his body. As we got him out of the van, I had to manoeuvre his wheelchair with his body in it. And they took him to hospital. And it was a bank holiday. And I wasn't allowed to see him till the Tuesday. And what people don't tell you is if someone dies in a public place, the police are involved. So I had to make a statement. I had police in my house. And that morning was the last time I ever left that house with Dec. And I came back with police. So I got to see Dec on the Tuesday. And then after that, when I was in the most darkest place ever, I had to arrange a funeral. The thing that would be the final page of that chapter of my life, and I had to write it whilst in the worst place. And people said comments to me like, well, they did only give him till he was 18, which is true. When he was first diagnosed, medical advances have come on in leaps and bounds. Well, at least you knew he was going to die. It was expected. It wasn't expected. It was August. They said it would be unlikely to make the new year, so it wasn't expected. Not one bit. I've had people say, at least you don't have to care for him anymore, you can live your life. Again, no. Dec and I shared a life. I might have been his hands and helped him physically, but what we shared emotionally and mentally was far from one-sided. Dec helped me more than anyone will know. I've actually silently been suffering with ADHD, something that Dec was one of the few people that knew about. And he knew how to regulate me. He knew how to help me rationalise things. And he also embraced when my childlike fun side would be up there. He embraced that. He never tried to change me. So he ended up having to have a post-mortem, which showed his kidneys had recovered. So he could have had his heart meds. And if he had had his heart meds, he would still be here. And he's not. So where do you go when you've spent 24 years of your life connected to the most incredible person that you had the absolute honour of being their mom, their dad, their best friend, their social worker, their counsellor, their physio, their personal shopper, their cook, their cleaner. Where do you go from that? When you still go and see his body every day until over 5 weeks later he's buried in the eco casket that he had mentioned he thought would be better than a wooden one, in a natural burial ground that he had also mentioned once that how beautiful it would be to not be in a graveyard but to be out with nature. Being escorted in a Subaru Impreza rather than a hearse, because he mentioned that years ago. Where do you go from there? What is Dec's legacy? Well, even nurses that hadn't long been working with Dec kept going on about this Dec effect, that they'd seen lots of people die, but none of it had hit as hard as losing Dec. So hashtag the Dec effect was born, unbeknown to me, and went viral on social media. So I decided to carry on that legacy, the Dec effect, spread the Dec effect, spread the kindness that my son showed people. It didn't matter who you were, what sexual orientation you had, what your beliefs were. Dec gave everyone a chance. Dec saw the good in people that sometimes didn't even deserve it. And he was a man who loved his van and wanted to shine some light on the world. And during that drive, our last drive, outside KFC, I even said to him, "What am I going to do in the future without you, darling?" And he sat there and went, "You'll help people because that's what you're good at." And I said, "I promise I'll try." And that's a promise I intend to keep. I actually thought, as soon as he's had his funeral, I'm gone, I'm joining him. I will have done my last act as a mom in his funeral, and then I'm joining him. It's funny what you think you'll do when you lose someone compared to what actually happens. Because I'm 21 months down the line, and I'd be lying if I said that thought doesn't enter my head at least once a week. But something, Dec, his legacy, a promise, is keeping me here. And starting the functioning Griefster. Why did I decide to start this? Because grieving parents' voices aren't heard. Grief in the UK is buried. Like, their names are expected to be buried with them. And I don't believe in that. Because what I've seen in the last 21 months is when people are forced to bury their grief, they become ill. And they're not living. They're pretending. I choose not to pretend. I choose to sit in my grief and to own it. Because my grief is enormous, because it represents the enormity of my love for Dec. I decided when I decided to do this podcast that I would also do a holistic grief coaching qualification so that I can look after whoever sits in the back of Dec's van with me for the podcast, that I will have the skills and the tool set to be able to treat their story with the care it deserves. So during that, which I started in January, I've learned a lot of tools how to help myself, and also how detrimental it can be when society try to stop people grieving or stop saying their loved one's name. Because I had, within days of losing Dec, people telling me, texting me, people I hadn't heard for years, about the stages of grief, and this will pass, and I do have a future. However, grief doesn't go in stages. It's not linear. I can't even compare it to a roller coaster. It is messy. It can be unregulated. It can be torturous. It can hold beauty at times. But one thing it's not is linear. It does not go in stages. And I want to share other people's stories, just like I've shared with you Dec's, who that person was. Dec, incredible, inspirational. He learnt to drive only with his hands. There is so many things that Dec did, staying in mainstream school despite the head teacher of his primary school wanting to send him to a special needs school when it wasn't needed. There was nothing wrong with Dec's brain. He fought the odds over and over and over again, because Dec was sent here to touch people's lives, and he did. I want to share the stories of how people have passed away, because it's not something we should shy away from. Each and every one of us are going to die in different ways. So over the course of the next 8 weeks, you'll hear from parents that have lost their children through TikTok challenges gone wrong, medical negligence, health problems, suicide, and even murder. Each of us parents grieve differently, but one thing that is the same, we ache for our children, and the way we can move forward in life is with our child by our side, with their name being said and celebrated. So they will sit here in the back of Dec's van with me. The van, yes, he passed away in, but the van gave him independence. It gave him a voice. It gave him so much joy. Why not film this in the back of his van, with his wheelchair still here and his spirit surrounding every single inch of this van? And we'll hear about how these parents are continuing their children's legacies. For me, that's the podcast. It's doing my holistic grief coaching, so hopefully in the future I can help other parents. It's taking Dec's van to car shows so that he can carry on inspiring the world, that even if you're in a wheelchair, you can still have, in his words, a sick ride too. You can still drive in style and still spreading the Dec effect. The main goal for this van is Wishes and Wheels, something Dec wanted to set up in his memory, where I will take people that have a terminal condition out in this van. It can be for a wish, such as going around a racetrack, or if they're going to an airport for a big wish. They're not going to be put in the back of a taxi, because Dec and I believe no one in a wheelchair should be stuck in the back. They'll be up front with me, and that is the only time Dec's wheelchair will come out of this van, is to put smiles on other wheelchair users' faces. Not everyone understands why I would choose to keep Dec's wheelchair in this van, but I'll tell you now why. There's only ever been one chair in the front of this van, and that was either as a passenger when Dec was driving, or as the driver when Dec was a passenger. There has never been 2 chairs, 2 car seats in the front of this van. And for there to now be one where Dec's chair is, that's not something I'm ready for. And this will always be Dec's van. Something I've learned since losing Declan is how grief affects your nervous system. People seem to see grief as something to get over, like a sprained ankle. But it's not. It's not something to get over. Not when it's deep grief. It's more like a broken leg that's been fractured in so many places. It takes time and healing, and you need other people's help. You need to take the weight off. You need to allow your body to repair. And in repairing, it will never be the same again. A broken leg might have metal plates, scarring. You might walk a bit differently. You'll never be the same when you've experienced deep grief. But that's okay, because it shapes who you become, and who you become is carrying that loved one with you. So no, grief isn't something to get over. The nervous system needs nourishing. The nervous system doesn't see time. It doesn't see, you lost Dec 21 months ago, you need to get over it. It sees your son, your soulmate, your everything is not here, and that still hurts. Your nervous system controls your body. So you have palpitations, you have headaches, you have memory loss, you can feel muscle pains. There is so much that your nervous system is affected by when you're grieving. There is so many symptoms that we just don't talk about. But over the course of the next 8 weeks, I will be looking into that and sharing with you ways and tools that you can help support your nervous system if you're grieving. Thank you for sharing mine and Dec's story with us. Next week, I will be with a lady called Sharon, who lost a little baby through medical negligence and has set up the Luca Foundation in his memory, and is making a big difference to those that are losing children and how their grief is dealt with. So please join me next week to hear Sharon's story. Thank you. This podcast is in honour of my son Declan, and for anyone out there who's lost someone they love, I see you, I feel you, I hear you. And I hope in some small way this helps you feel a little less alone. Keep your heart safe until next time. And don't forget to follow or subscribe. Your support helps keep this podcast going.